You know what I still find the most annoying thing about Tailwind? The fact that you can really create a big mess when trying to define all these class names, especially if you have a component that has a lot of different variants of itself. Take for example a button that can either be a primary button or a secondary button, maybe even a destructive button. The button can be disabled, maybe there's a variation in size, you have a large button, you have a smaller button. All of these different props you pass into that button will change something in its class names. And don't get me wrong, like it's not a problem of Tailwind, because Tailwind gives you all of the freedom in deciding how you build this. But there actually lies a problem. Because it's so open, you usually see that there's a lot of different approaches people take in this, and sometimes even in one project. And that usually results in quite a big mess as soon as you have a more complicated component. So not that long ago, when I was still styling all my components in CSSinJS, I was actually using a library called Stitches to also help in styling these things in CSSinJS as well. And if we look at their website, you see how it works. What you see here is that when creating a new component, you actually define an object called variance. And in this object, you can nest different properties. And each of these properties eventually will map to a property of your, in this case, React component as well. So if you, for example, add a size property you see here, by doing that, you're actually defining different sizes this button can have. And based on the value of the prop you pass in, the actual CSS that's nested inside that object will get rendered. So this gives you kind of a structure to define what should change in the styles of a component when a certain prop gets passed in. And there is one more thing that makes this even greater to use. And Stitches calls that compound variance. Because think about it, what should happen if a primary button is also disabled? Let's say primary button is green. Should it then still be green, or should it become grayish, or a more toned down green color? That totally depends on the design system, of course. But it's these combinations that are usually the cause of a lot of really weird if statements in your code to get the right code, because the primary button should maybe a grayish green color, but the secondary is perhaps a blue color that's a bit grayish. So there's all of these different variants in color and in styles that you need to define. And something like this has been lacking, in my opinion, for Tailwind. Until recently, when I discovered this library called Class Variance Authority, or CVA in short, which does exactly this, but for Tailwind. If we look at their examples on the GitHub page, we see that they're doing something pretty similar to what Stitches does as well. But they're, instead of rendering styles, rendering different class names for Tailwind. So what I want to do today is try to build Shopify's own button component from their design system and take in a few variants they also offer in their design system, like the primary button or a destructive button, and see what the difference would be if we would build this in plain Tailwind or with CVA. So let's jump right in and see if this can improve our workflow. So while looking at Shopify's button, I noticed that for every different variant you select, for example, primary or destructive, I noticed that they add in a different property to the component. But also if you, for example, combine multiple, they're always adding a different prop to the component. This does actually bring one small downside, and that is that you are able to create variants that aren't real variants. You could, for example, make a primary destructive button, which is probably not something they want to exist. But if we go to the Code Sandbox page, you see that we can actually add in primary and destructive, and that will still render something, albeit not a correct button probably. So when trying to replicate this component, I actually also changed a bit of the props around to try to make all these impossible variants impossible. Because most of the time, that's actually a smart thing to do in a design system. Make all these impossible variants impossible, really weird variants of components, and create things that should not exist. So if we look at the code I already wrote as preparation, you see that I actually added a few props to this button. One is variant, where you can pass in 4 different variants: default, primary, destructive, or monochrome. A modifier, which can make a button plain or outlined. A size, slim, medium, and large. and two Boolean properties, full width and loading. And you also can pass in a native button property called disabled, which will also change something in the styles. So if we scroll down a little bit, you see also that I added a few defaults. If you do not pass in a size, then the size will become medium and the variant will become default. And now we get actually to the Tailwind class name generation. You see it's a lot. But if we look on the left side, you also see that there is actually a lot of different variants of this button as well. There are smaller buttons, bigger buttons, outline buttons, disabled buttons, spinning buttons, and that in 4 different variants as well. So that already makes it quite complicated. And then I actually even tried to do my very best to make this as structured as possible. But yeah, you have to agree, it's a lot. So if we quickly look through this code, you see that first I start with some general styles that are always applied, which are actually not a lot. And then you see there's different variants, which all set, for example, a background color, a text color, and a shadow for the default button. Next to that, we have the modifiers, either the outline, which overrides the color to the current text color, and does the same for the shadow. And for a destructive button that's outlined, we change the text color as well. For the plain button, we've also overwritten a few styles to remove a border, make padding a bit smaller. And again, for the destructive and primary button, also change the text color. And the same goes for different sizes of the button. It's mainly a text size and a padding change. And for a disabled button, also changing the background color and the text color of the buttons. So perhaps when someone talks you through this, you're actually thinking, well, it's not too bad. And it's true, but also take into account that, for example, this does not include any hover or focus states yet. All of the buttons don't do anything when you hover them. And perhaps there's even more complicated variants that you also want to combine. And last but not least, I knew about all the variants when creating this. But imagine that there wasn't any outlined version of the button, for example, that could cause you to write styles in a different way than when you knew about it up front. So next to this quite tidy way of writing the class names, I also created a different variant of the same button where you actually generate the class names in a slightly different way, which is something you come across quite often, but which I'm also not a huge fan of. So if I go to this buttons not so neatly structured file, you see that I'm taking a slightly different approach here. I am creating a variable that contains all of the different class names that we want to render, and later on I'm attaching them to the class name of the button itself. So in here, I'm actually doing a bit more complicated if statements, but the end result is actually the same. But looking at this, you already see that you need to take even more time to know what this is actually doing. And in my opinion, that's mainly because they're not really grouped together by what a different variant of button should do, how, for example, a primary button should look like, but they are rather grouped by, for example, border or background color, which is something that's irrelevant if you quickly want to scan how a component would behave. In that case, it's way easier to see the full picture of a certain variant instead of all of the different variants combined for a single property. And exactly code like this is what I'm mostly worried about, because this is kind of a bug waiting to happen, because this is not really, in my opinion, something that's quickly maintainable. People will easily make mistakes because you just simply overlook something. And if we quickly go back to the previous button, there's also already a bug in this code as well. And it maybe has a little bit to do with the way we wrote our code, but it's also something that's good to know when writing Tailwind. Because what you see here is that our plain button has a padding X of 2 and a padding Y of 1, whereas the different sizes also set their own padding. So what is currently happening is that all of these Tailwind classes are concatenated together into a long string. So if we inspect this button, you see that this button has both the smaller paddings from the plain class as well as the larger paddings from the large size. And the reason that the largest padding is applied doesn't actually have anything to do with the order that the class names are defined, because CSS completely ignores the order the class names are defined in the class attribute. The only thing that takes precedence is the specificity of the CSS. And in case of Tailwind, as long as you don't do anything special, all of the generic classes are of the same specificity. So as soon as all of the classes are the same specificity, what the browser will look at next is the order in which they get loaded in the CSS file. So if one property comes after the next property in the CSS file and has the same specificity, then that property will always be the one that's used. So in this case, the padding x of 6 is after the padding x of 2 in the file. So that's why it's taking precedence. So if we, for example, change this to padding x of 20, you already see that it changes, where it's still the first padding x that's defined, but it's later in the file. So in case you're using Tailwind, it's also really important to actually not define duplicate properties, because it might look like it works, but perhaps it does not, simply because there's different orders in the way the CSS is loaded. And it could even be that because of hot reloading in the dev environment, it actually seems to work, but as soon as it gets built, everything gets put in the correct order and then it will break in production. So it's always good in these cases to also prevent defining duplicate properties as well. So my advice in this case would be to copy the padding and add a different check where we check that the modifier is not equal to plain and the size equals slim, and only then apply the different styles. This way, the padding will not get rendered if the variant is plain, and then only this padding will be applied. So we now can do the exact same thing for the medium size and large size as well. And with the help of Copilot, that seems to be pretty easy actually. Now we should not forget to remove the old paddings from the previous declarations. And with that, you already see that our button actually became smaller and there's no duplicate padding properties rendered anymore. So, and after we've looked how a button would look without CVA, it's now time to convert it to CVA and see if the code becomes better in maintainability, structure, readability, or perhaps not at all. What I already did is create a new file called button CVA, where I've only added in a basic button. The next step we need to do, of course, is install Class Variance Authority by running yarn add Class Variance Authority. And when we did that, we are able to create a new button by creating a variable called button, which equals CVA, where we import CVA from Class Variance Authority. And as a first parameter to this function, we actually input all of the shared class names of the button. And the second property of this function is an object that contains all of the different variants. The variants itself are nested inside an object called variants. And if we look on the left side, I actually decided to create a variant called variant. To me, it feels very natural to have a button that has a property variant called primary or secondary. CVA itself usually uses the word intent for that, so decide whatever suits you best. But for now, I will stick with variant. And you can add any of these properties by just creating a new property inside the object. And all of the keys that you write inside this object will become valid values for the button property. So in our case, that will be default, primary, destructive, and monochrome. And if we look at our code on the left side, we can actually already copy in a few of these class names as well to set the correct styles. Monochrome, primary, and destructive. What I also already did when setting this project up is also create this overview page where you can see all the buttons. But next to the default button, I also already added a placeholder for the CVA button as well. So if we go to the app.tsx, you see that there's one section that has the default button and the second section that has the CVA button where I actually already render all of the different variants. So what we can do now is, instead of importing them from button as well, which I did as an initial setup, actually import the CVA variants from button CVA. And what you will immediately see is that we are getting some type errors because right now we don't have any other types than children defined, but that's something we will fix down the road. So if we now go back to that preview page, you see that there's no styles applied yet. And that is of course because right now we are only defining this object, but not doing anything with it. So what CVA does is this button is actually a function that you can set as an input for the class name. So if we run this function, it will return a class name string based on the different props of the button, or actually not based on different props of the button, but based on the arguments you pass in, which should be the different props of the button. So the next step in order to get that to work is to extract all of the different props from the button and input them into that function. And if we look at our default button, we actually defined all of those manually. However, CVA gives us the option to do this automatically based on the object we define here, which is actually really neat because that way it's also impossible to create a typo, for example, and then create a property that does not exist or is not used in CVA. We can do so by actually extending our button props also from variant props, where you pass in type of button. And if we pass in this variant props type of button, it will automatically add the variant prop to our button props type. So this way we can extract the variant and already insert it into the button function. So if we now go back to our button, we see already that the colors are applied. Of course, that's not everything, but that's simply because we did not move over all of the different properties yet. So let's do that next. So to keep track of what we already copied in and what not, I will actually add a comment in front of all the different things we moved over, because the next step is actually the different modifiers. So that means that we need to create a new modifier variant in here, which can either have a value of outline. And look at Copilot already being this smart that it knows that I actually want to move the value from the left side over to the right side. So let's just autocomplete that and also add in the plain variant where we also copy these values over. And then we comment these two lines. And for now, we are actually leaving the destructive and primary outlines for a second because we're actually going to use compound variants down the road for this. The next variant we of course have is size, where we have slim, which only has text as M, medium, which is the same, and large, which has text base. Next up is full width, although instead of a string, this is actually a Boolean, but CVA also gives you the option to render a Boolean true or false in here. And finally, we do the same thing for disabled, which also is a Boolean property for which we copy these values in. And while we copied in disabled, what happened down here is that an error popped up because it's actually complaining that there is already a property disabled in the button HTML attributes. And that disabled property is actually different from the Boolean we set here, because instead of a Boolean, it can also be null or undefined in the default React types. So since we only want it to be a Boolean, it's actually a good thing to let the variant props take precedence over what is in the button HTML props. And we can do so by actually adding omit around the button HTML properties, where we can omit the disabled property. And if we do that, the button props is happy again. Of course, we should not forget to extract these modifier, size, full, width, and disabled variants from the props as well and pass them into the button function. And as soon as we've done that, we already see that we're a little bit closer to where we want to be. The main things missing now are these compound variants. So let's add those in next. As a second property to the root object, we can define the compound variants, which takes an array of different compound variants you want to apply a specific style. So the first one you see, which we skipped, is the outline modifier and destructive variant. We can style them by adding modifier outline and variant destructive. And you see already that Copilot is super smart again and knows that we want to add a class name text destructive to this. And that's actually the only thing we need to do. CVA is now smart enough to look at these different variants that we pass in and see if this class name should be applied as well, because both of these variants are active. We should do the same thing for the primary outline, of course, modifier outline, variant primary, and class name text primary. And we also have some variants for the plain modifier that we want to set, where modifier equals plain, variant destructive, and the text becomes text destructive again, and the same thing for the primary variant. That leaves two more, which are firstly the paddings for the different buttons when the modifier plain is not applied. So we can add them again by setting modifier to null first, which means there is no modifier passed in, and the size slim, and the padding. And a similar thing should also happen for the modifier outline. And then we actually need to copy this object 2 more times to add in the medium size and the padding, as well as the large size. And what in my opinion would actually still be a really nice improvement is if instead of defining multiple modifiers here, where we need to say it should be null or outline, we could, for example, say it should be either null or outline. This way, instead of creating 2 different compound variants, we could only define 1, or just say it should be not plain. And by doing that, it would make it way more organized and we would have a lot of less duplicate code, which again makes this better maintainable and a lot easier and quicker to scan. And if you do support that, check out this pull request I created and give it an upvote as well, because I think it's really useful. And in my opinion, it would make this tool even better. So let's convince Joe together. But all jokes aside, let's for now remove this modifier again and add the outline in here. And after we've done that, there's only one compound variant left, which is disabled true and variant default, which should add a different border on there. And finally, we can add one more property, which is default variance. And inside default variance, we can say that the variant should be default and the size should be medium. This way, we don't need to always specify the default variance to a button. And these styles will get applied by default. And as soon as we've done that, saved it and go back to our components, we see that we have all the variants back. The only variant missing still is the loading variant. But if we look at the alt buttons code, you actually see that this does not add any class names to the component itself. Rather, it manipulates a few child components. So let's quickly copy that over as well, since we can just replace all the children with this HTML. And then we need to make sure that we add the loading boolean in here. And this loading boolean should be added to the button props itself because it's not part of the CVA configuration, since it does not add any styles. So we can just add it in here as a boolean and then also destructure it from the props. And by that, we should have a loading button. And look at that, we do. So as a quick summary, it might be good to put these two side by side one more time. So let me quickly uncomment the lines again. And if we put them side by side, you see that there's actually quite a bit of a difference, because to me, the CVA side looks quite a bit more structured. Whereas on the left side, it's pretty neat, especially if you think about the not so neatly structured version I showed you before, which is also still an alternative we should not forget, because this is the type of code you see in production as well. But it still feels that on the right side, it's a lot quicker to see what different types of variants there are. Although on the left side, you could, of course, also look at the interface. But you need to scroll a lot up and down, left and right, to really get a complete picture. Where with CVA, you immediately see what different variants there are and what type of styles they apply. The only downside right now is that you need to define quite a few of compound variants, and especially quite a few duplicate compound variants to override class names. Whereas on the left side, you can use a bit more JavaScript, like does not equal, for example, which is not offered by CVA yet. But I really hope they will implement this in the future, because as soon as they do that, that also ensures that these compound variants drop in half or maybe 1/3, which in my opinion would make this a breeze to use. And not per se because it's maybe a better overview, but mostly also because it forces you to write your code in a certain way. So that also means that everyone will write their styles in this way. I cannot add a little if statement somewhere in between and do something just a little bit different. Use a ternary if statement in one place and maybe use a function to generate a class name because it's more complicated. If you use CVA, everyone will do it in the exact same way, which makes your code way more predictable for a developer to know where to find certain stuff and how things should work. So in my opinion, it definitely makes sense to use CVA for bigger components, especially within design systems where it's really important to create these tight boundaries in how components should work, how they are structured, and also to make sure that you don't break one of the 5 variants when you change something else. What I'm definitely not recommending is creating all your components with CVA. Only use this tool when it makes sense. If you're building a very huge design system or have a really complicated component that has a lot of different variants within it. CVA is not a library that's really big in file size. So it's definitely something you can only use within a few components. And that should, as long as you're not building a full design system, absolutely be the way you're using this. Should not be the default for every component, because that makes it just overkill and takes away all of the benefits of Tailwind for quickly writing components and just iterating really quickly, because you're adding a tool in between. You should only add it when it makes sense. And that is when you have a component that has a lot of different variants. So I hope with this video, I was able to show you how you can create better design systems within Tailwind as well, without losing your mind with all the class names and ternary operators and everything that otherwise would be involved in this. In my opinion, CVA is really a blessing to use when you're building really big components. So I hope you enjoyed this one, and let me know if you've used it in production anywhere and what your experience is with it. Please subscribe, leave a like down below, and I'll see you in the next one.